My name is Walter Bryce. I am 82 years old, and I live alone in a modest ranch-style house on the southern edge of Tucson, Arizona. My days have settled into the quiet rhythm of late age. Slow mornings with weak coffee and dry toast, long afternoons beneath a ceiling fan that spins as if out of obligation rather than function, and evenings that drag on with the same shows I've seen a dozen times. I sleep in the same bed I once shared with my wife, Mary Ann, though her side has been empty for nearly 7 years. I still keep her pillow untouched, as if the weight of her head might somehow return to it. Her smell is long gone, though I sometimes pretend I catch a trace of her lavender soap, especially when the wind moves a certain way through the cracked window. My house is filled with memories I've refused to pack away. Photo albums, dried flowers from our 35th anniversary, letters she wrote me while I was stationed in Korea, and, above all, her wedding ring, a simple band of gold with a small etching on the inside. Forever, W and M, 1959. That ring had more soul than most people I've met in my life. I kept it in a small velvet box inside my bedside drawer, wrapped in a silk handkerchief. I would take it out some nights and hold it against my chest, the metal cool and steady against my thinning skin. It wasn't about mourning anymore. Not really. It was about remembering what it felt like to matter to someone, to be someone's person. My daughter, Kimberly, doesn't understand this kind of sentimentality. She's in her late 50s now, works in marketing or consulting, some kind of job that involves presentations and power suits and jargon. I stopped trying to follow years ago. Her husband, Evan, is one of those quiet types who speaks in phrases borrowed from finance blogs and golf buddies. They live in Flagstaff, but rarely visit. When they do, it's never spontaneous. It's scheduled like a business trip. "Dad, we can come next Saturday, but we'll only have an hour or two." They bring prepackaged smiles, awkward hugs, and leave behind the faint scent of hotel shampoo and car air fresheners. We used to be a family. Real, breathing, laughing family. I remember Sundays when Mary Ann would cook pancakes for breakfast and Kimberly, barely 10, would run into the kitchen barefoot, dragging her teddy bear behind her. We'd sit around the table sticky with syrup and warm with love. But that was before life happened. Before Kimberly grew up and decided that everything sentimental was a burden, that anything older than 5 years should be sold or replaced, that emotions were for the weak and inefficient. I don't blame her entirely. The world has changed. People are quicker now, to leave, to sell, to forget. They call it decluttering. They speak of emotional minimalism, as if love was a piece of furniture that could be hauled away. I've become, in their eyes, not a father or a man, but a project, a logistical challenge, an obligation to manage. Kimberly calls every few weeks. "Just checking in, Dad," she says, but she doesn't wait for the answers. It's always followed by a suggestion. "Have you thought more about the assisted living place we discussed? Or maybe it's time to get rid of some of the old stuff. It's not healthy to dwell." She says this house is too big for me, as if square footage is what defines loneliness. She doesn't see the house the way I do. Every floorboard, every dent on the doorframe, every creak in the hallway. They all tell a story. Mary Ann painted that hallway herself. She slipped on the stepladder and ended up laughing so hard that we forgot what we were arguing about. That dent in the guest room door? Kimberly slammed it when she was 16 and heartbroken over a boy named Jared. I didn't fix it. I never wanted to. It reminded me that she had once felt something deeply. Now she speaks of asset consolidation. I haven't seen my grandchildren in almost 2 years. They're busy, Kimberly says. College, internships, careers, always something. I send cards on birthdays and Christmas. I rarely get a thank you. Sometimes I wonder if they even remember my voice. It's strange how people can disappear from your life without ever dying. You just slowly fade from relevance until you're a memory they don't feel obliged to maintain. I used to imagine a different kind of old age, filled with laughter, Sunday dinners, grandchildren crawling on the floor, asking me questions about how things were back in the day. But instead, I find myself talking to the television or reading. The same passage in the newspaper 3 times, just to fill the silence. Last Christmas, Kimberly and Evan sent me a gift card. It was for a fancy steakhouse in Phoenix. I can't drive long distances anymore. They knew that. When I mentioned it, Kimberly laughed nervously and said, "Oh, well, maybe you can give it to one of your friends?" I don't have friends. They all either moved away or died. The last person I called a friend was Jerry Myers from down the block. He passed away 3 summers ago. Heart failure. No one even claimed his dog. I think about that sometimes. What will happen to me when I go? Will Kimberly even know the name of my funeral director? Will she even come? This isn't self-pity, mind you. It's just clarity. A clear-eyed look at what happens when love is treated like a resource to be optimized rather than something to be honored. I'm not naive. I know I'm not the easiest man. I'm stubborn, opinionated, a little too slow to accept the modern world. But I've loved deeply. I've provided. I've sacrificed. And the one thing I held on to, that wedding ring, Mary Ann's ring, wasn't about sentiment. It was a promise, a memory made solid, a piece of my wife that no fire, no time, no grief could take away. And yet they did. Not with a crowbar, not with violence, but with laughter, with apathy, with smirking, casual cruelty. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started with a visit. A casual, we're just in the area kind of visit. I should have known better, but I wanted to believe, even then, that maybe, just maybe, my daughter had remembered who I was, who I had been, who I still am. It was a Thursday afternoon in early May when Kimberly and Evan showed up unannounced at my front door. The Arizona sun had already begun to scorch the pavement, and I had been dozing lightly in my recliner, the muted hum of the ceiling fan blending with the old jazz record spinning on the turntable. Their knock startled me, firm, rehearsed, not like someone dropping in for a cup of coffee. I opened the door to find Kimberly in a sleeveless beige blouse and wide sunglasses perched on her head, the kind of glasses she used to mock Mary Ann for wearing, and Evan, as always, in a collared shirt and khakis, his mouth already set in that polite smirk that never quite reached his eyes. "Dad," Kimberly said with too much enthusiasm, leaning in to hug me, though I could feel the stiffness in her embrace. We were nearby for a conference in Scottsdale. Thought we'd drop in, see how you're doing. I blinked, caught somewhere between surprise and confusion. "You're 3 hours from Scottsdale," I muttered, but she only laughed, brushing past me into the living room. Evan followed without a word, scanning the room like he was taking inventory. "You've kept the place exactly the same," he said, not sounding particularly complimentary. "Why wouldn't I?" I replied, closing the door behind them. Kimberly had already made herself at home, flipping through the mail on my side table, straightening the stack of coasters, tugging at a corner of the curtain like she was inspecting for mold. They didn't sit. They hovered. The energy was wrong. Too rehearsed, too efficient, and it set something off in my gut. I asked if they wanted iced tea. Kimberly declined. Evan said, "Maybe later," and then they launched into what they'd clearly rehearsed in the car. "Dad," Kimberly began, her voice bright, falsely casual, "we were just thinking. It might be time to go through some of the old things. Not throw them away, just, sort and simplify. Maybe we could help you with that." I looked at her, silent. Her expression didn't flicker. I glanced at Evan, who stood by the bookshelf like a supervisor waiting for the labor to begin. My chest tightened, and I felt the air turn heavy. "What things?" I asked, already knowing. "Oh, just boxes, closets, stuff in the garage. You've got things in there from, the 60s? "That's the point," I said. "They belong there." "But do you really need all of it?" she pressed on as if I hadn't spoken. "It's not healthy, Dad, to hang on to everything. We're not saying throw it out. Just declutter. Make it easier on you. You said your back's been acting up." I hadn't said anything of the sort, but I knew where this was going. It wasn't about my back. It was about control. It was about putting their hands where they didn't belong. "I don't need help," I said quietly, moving toward my recliner, my sanctuary. "Everything here is where it's supposed to be." Kimberly gave Evan a look, a flicker of eyebrows, a tight-lipped smile, and he took that as his cue to act. He walked toward the hallway closet and opened it without asking. "Just getting a head start," he said, already reaching inside. "Stop," I said, louder than I meant to. "Leave it." But Kimberly was already in motion, crossing to the drawer beside my bed. "What about the jewelry?" she asked. "Mom's stuff? It's not doing anyone any good in the dark." I stood up, blood rushing to my ears. "That stays." "It's not worth much," she said, pulling open drawers like they were hers to open. "We can get it appraised, maybe make sure it's insured. You know, in case something happens to the house." She found the box in the second drawer, exactly where I'd left it. The small velvet case that held Marianne's wedding ring. My voice broke as I stepped toward her. "Put that back." But she already had it open, holding the ring up to the light. "It's just gold," she said dismissively. "Not even a diamond. People don't wear these anymore." I stared at her, my daughter, my flesh and blood, holding the most sacred piece of my life between her fingers like it was a cheap trinket. "It's not about the gold," I whispered. Kimberly shrugged, snapped the box shut, and dropped it in her handbag. "I'll get it cleaned," she said. "You'll thank me later." I lunged, not gracefully, not quickly, but with all the desperation of a man watching a coffin being nailed shut. Evan stepped between us. "Easy," he said, raising a hand like I was a wild animal. "Don't do anything you'll regret." I froze, every muscle rigid with fury and helplessness. Kimberly smoothed her skirt, adjusted her bag, and turned toward the door. "We'll be back tomorrow," she said, "with some donation boxes. Just take it easy tonight." And then they left. Just like that. I sat back down, my hands trembling, the spot on my chest where the ring had so often rested now aching with an invisible weight. I stared at the door, waiting, foolishly, for them to come back, to say it was a mistake, a joke, anything. But the silence told me all I needed to know. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed until dawn. The empty velvet indentation where the ring used to sit burned into my mind like a scar. Around 3 a.m, I turned on my computer. I barely used the damn thing, but I knew how to search. I typed in "gold ring pawn Tucson." Within minutes I found a post on some social media account, my granddaughter's of all things, showing a photo of Kimberly and Evan holding a wad of cash and laughing in front of a pawn shop sign. The caption read, "Decluttering Dad's junk. Vegas, here we come." They had sold it. The ring. Marianne's ring. My wife's memory. Sold it for a weekend of slot machines and overpriced cocktails. And they laughed. That was the moment something in me shifted. Not anger, not grief. Something colder. Clearer. The realization that they hadn't just taken something from me. They had erased something sacred. And if they could do that with a ring, what else might they be planning? They thought I was just a relic with a checkbook and no fight left. They were wrong, and they were going to find out just how wrong they were. Not with yelling. Not with tears, but with something much harder to forget. I was done hoping, done waiting. Now it was my turn. The morning after they took the ring, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the same cracked mug I had used for over a decade, filled with coffee that had long since gone cold, and I wondered how many other things had been slowly, quietly taken from me over the years without my noticing. It wasn't just the wedding ring. That was only the final insult, the last shard of something sacred they had ground into dust. It was dignity, autonomy, presence. It was every decision that had been made for me instead of with me, every favor they called a help, every silence that followed my voicemails, every half-hearted birthday call 2 days late, every time they had referred to me in the third person, while I was in the room, as though I had already died and they were speaking to my ghost. I sat in that silence for hours, not moving, not eating, just listening to the clock tick above the refrigerator, the same clock Marianne had bought at a flea market in 1978, the ticking now louder than my own breath. It sounded like the countdown to something I could no longer ignore. Around noon, Kimberly called. I let it ring out. A second later, a text. "Don't be dramatic, Dad. We'll talk this weekend. Please don't start spiraling again." I stared at the word spiraling for a long time. Was that how she described my grief? My anger? My refusal to be robbed of the only things that still meant something to me? I didn't reply. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly. I stood up and made my way to the bedroom, opened the drawer, and stared at the empty space where the ring had always rested. I ran my fingers over the velvet, trying to summon the weight that was no longer there. My knees buckled, and I sat on the edge of the bed, breathing hard, trying not to cry, because even now, even after everything, some part of me still felt shame at letting the pain show, at being seen as weak or difficult. I stayed like that for most of the afternoon until the sky turned the color of rust and the air cooled enough for me to step outside. The neighbors, the Wilsons, were barbecuing again. They waved. I nodded. They probably didn't know Marianne had died 7 years ago. No one around here really asked anymore. People move. They forget. They wave at each other from across lawns like it means something. I sat on the porch and watched the sunset, trying to decide what to do. I thought about calling the pawn shop, asking if they still had the ring, if maybe I could buy it back. But what would I even say? That my daughter had stolen it? That she'd sold it for gas money and tequila shots? Would they even care? Would they even believe me? Number, I knew how that would go. I knew the look they'd give me. I'd seen it before, from bank tellers, from grocery store clerks, from nurses. That polite, distant patience reserved for old men who talked too much, who lingered, who forgot things. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with my hands folded over my chest like a man waiting to be buried, and I thought about every time I had said yes to Kimberly. Yes to the money for her first apartment. Yes to co-signing on their second mortgage. Yes to helping with the twins' tuition. Yes to signing over access to my accounts just in case. Yes to letting them store things in my garage, my attic, my closets, until my home looked more like a second-hand warehouse than the house Marianne and I had built together. I had said yes because I loved her, because I believed that love, real love, meant sacrifice, meant trust, meant never turning your back on your child, even when they treated you like a loose thread in their perfect lives. But now, lying in that dark room, the ceiling fan spinning above me like a lazy wheel of fate, I realized that all my yeses had led to this: silence, theft, and humiliation. The next morning, I took a walk down to the local community center where they held the monthly veterans' breakfasts. I hadn't gone in years, not since my legs started aching more than they used to, not since the newer guys, the ones from Iraq and Afghanistan, started joining. I always felt like an artifact around them. But that morning, I needed to see someone who didn't look at me like a burden. I needed to hear my own name said without pity. The center was already buzzing when I arrived, the smell of powdered eggs and weak coffee wafting out the open door. I saw Frank Mendez, who used to work on the school board, and he clapped me on the shoulder like no time had passed. We sat for a while, trading stories. I didn't mention the ring, or Kimberly, or the emptiness in my chest. I just talked about baseball, about old cars, About the time Marianne had made 3 pies for the 4th of July picnic, and I'd dropped one face down on the sidewalk. It felt good to laugh, even if it felt borrowed. On my way out, Frank walked with me to the parking lot. He said, "You know, Walt, you ever need anything, someone to talk to, someone to check in, you let me know." I nodded, said thank you, but didn't really believe it. Not because Frank was lying, but because I knew I wouldn't ask. I'd lived long enough to know that real help rarely came from offers. It came from action. And I had made a decision. That afternoon, I dug through my files. I pulled out old bank records, the deed to the house, the list of assets Marianne and I had compiled back when we made our wills. I went through everything with a fine-tooth comb, looking for the places Kimberly had gotten in, the cracks she had exploited. I found the joint account she still had access to. I found the credit card we'd once set up for emergencies that I hadn't used in over a year. I found paperwork I didn't even remember signing. Authorizations, permissions, digital access agreements. I called the bank. They asked security questions I hadn't heard in a decade. I spent 2 hours on hold. But by the end of the day, I'd locked down every account, changed every password, revoked every access. It felt like reclaiming a country I hadn't realized was under occupation. That night, Kimberly called again. I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail. "Dad, can you please stop being so difficult? It's just a ring. Mom would have wanted us to use it for something fun, not keep it rotting in a drawer. We're family. Don't make this ugly." Her voice, so smug in its fake concern, made my stomach turn. She hadn't asked how I was. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't even offered to return it. Just rationalizations, justifications, a cold-blooded script written by someone who believed themselves above consequence. And that was when I realized something else. They hadn't just taken something from me. They had dared me to stop them. They believed deeply that I was powerless, that I wouldn't do anything, that I couldn't. And maybe they were right, until now, because that ring wasn't just a ring. It was the last trace of a promise I made to Marianne, and I was going to honor that promise. Not by begging for it back, not by crying at their feet, but by making sure they could never take anything from me again. They wanted to laugh at the past. Fine, let them. I was about to remind them that old men don't always go quietly. Some of us remember everything, and some of us keep score. It was a Wednesday when I finally understood just how deep their betrayal ran, and how much further they intended to go. The desert heat had been pressing down on the house since early morning, the kind of heat that made the walls sweat and the air feel like it had weight. I had spent the better part of the day organizing old papers in the den, trying to reclaim not just order but control, gathering every scrap of evidence I could find of who I was, what I owned, what had once belonged to Marianne, and still, in some way, belonged to me. I had this idea that if I could physically see my life in documents and receipts, I could defend it better. It was an odd ritual, maybe even a pathetic one, but there was a strange comfort in the tactility of paper. It reminded me that I existed, that my life had texture, proof, dimension beyond how others chose to remember it. I was in the middle of sorting through an envelope of old utility bills when the phone rang. Not my cell, but the house line, which almost never rang anymore. I let it go to the machine, not wanting to hear Kimberly's voice again, not ready for another performance of faux concern. But this time, it wasn't her. It was a woman. Polite, distant, practiced. She introduced herself as someone from the Financial Services Division of a legal office in Flagstaff, calling to confirm that I would be attending the meeting on Friday regarding the finalization of my guardianship designation. My heart stopped mid-beat. I played the message again. Guardianship. My guardianship. A meeting I had apparently agreed to. My knees gave way, and I dropped into the old office chair, the bills in my hand spilling to the floor like autumn leaves. I knew immediately what this was. They hadn't just taken the ring. They were trying to take everything. Not just my finances, not just the house, but me. My very right to be myself, to make my own decisions, to live without being managed like a fragile relic. I sat frozen for a long time, my breath shallow, my mind trying to catch up with the implications. They had gone to a lawyer. They were building a case. They were likely gathering evidence. Every missed call, every repeated story, every stumble or forgetful moment. They were painting a picture of a confused old man, incapable, lost, and they were planning to submit that picture as truth. I picked up the phone and called the number from the voicemail. A receptionist answered, and after a moment of shuffling transferred me to the same woman who had left the message. I told her, calmly but firmly, that I had never agreed to such a meeting, never authorized a guardianship, and had no intention of doing so. There was a pause on the line, just a half-second, but I heard it. That shift in tone that comes when someone realizes they've made a mistake but doesn't want to admit it. She told me, in a careful voice, that the request had come from my daughter and son-in-law, citing concerns about my recent mental decline and erratic behavior. They had presented documentation, she said, including a statement from a private physician. I laughed then, not from humor but disbelief, the kind that makes your skin crawl because the absurdity is so complete. I hadn't seen a doctor in nearly 8 months, and even then it had been a routine checkup where the most dramatic event was my blood pressure being slightly elevated from too much diner coffee. I asked for the name of the physician. She refused to give it. Privacy laws, she said, legal protocol. I told her I would be contacting my own lawyer, and she politely told me that was, of course, my right. After the call ended, I just sat there for a long time, staring out the window at the dusty street, watching as the UPS truck rumbled past without stopping. I realized I was shaking. Not from fear, but from rage, a kind of quiet, boiling rage that burns slow and low like coals beneath a fire. They wanted me out of the way. They wanted to finish the job they started when they laughed and sold Marianne's ring. That was the opening salvo, the test. And now they were coming for the rest. They were counting on the fact that I wouldn't fight back, that I was too old, too tired, too alone. And maybe I was. But I was also something else. I was done pretending that silence was strength. I was done mistaking endurance for acceptance. I called Martin Holloway, the same lawyer who had helped me settle Marianne's estate after her passing. A quiet, sharp man in his 60s who didn't talk much but listened well. I told him everything, about the ring, about the bank accounts, about the guardianship petition. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "They're laying groundwork for a power of attorney transfer. Probably want access to your accounts, real estate, maybe even full medical authority. You're smart to get ahead of this." I asked him what my options were. He said we'd start by filing a legal objection to the guardianship motion and requesting an independent psychological and medical evaluation to establish my competency. He told me not to contact Kimberly or Evan. He'd handle all communication from now on, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. Not because the storm had passed, but because I had finally found a place to stand in it. I hung up the phone and stood in the middle of my living room, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, by the memories embedded in walls and furniture, and I knew this house, this life, was not going to be taken from me by people who saw me only as a bank account wrapped in old skin. They had made a mistake, a serious one. They had underestimated the power of a man who had nothing left to lose. I had survived war, watched friends die in foreign soil, buried the love of my life, and endured the long, slow loneliness of being forgotten by the very people I helped create. But this was different. This was not the creeping passage of time. This was theft, calculated and cold. They thought they were writing the ending of my story. What they didn't realize is that I had just picked up the pen. The following week passed like a prolonged and slow-burning fuse, a time of waiting laced with action, where every day seemed to stretch endlessly while the legal machinery, so old and stubborn in its rhythm, began to turn. I had met with Martin in person at his office downtown, a modest space stacked with leather-bound files and lined with the scent of paper, wood polish, and patience. He had asked me questions about my routines, my finances, my health, and my mental clarity, not because he doubted me, but because he knew that in court, appearances and documentation outweighed truth. He arranged for me to undergo an independent cognitive and psychiatric evaluation, scheduled me for a full physical with a doctor of his choosing, and began filing the paperwork to block the guardianship petition Kimberly and Evan had submitted. Behind my back, when I asked if we could press criminal charges for fraud, for misrepresentation, for unauthorized use of my accounts, he told me the law rarely moved in such straight lines, but there were other ways. I understood what he meant. It wasn't about revenge, at least not in the childish sense of the word. It was about rebalancing the scale. About ensuring that whatever story Kimberly had tried to write in secret would now have an alternative version entered into the public record. A version written in my own hand, not theirs. In the meantime, I took inventory of everything they still had access to. I called every bank where I held funds, changed all logins and passwords, revoked all power of attorney permissions, and ordered detailed statements for the last 12 months. I found 3 transfers Kimberly had made from our old joint account to her personal savings, disguised as medical reimbursement and caregiving stipend. I called the manager at that bank, a young woman named Rachel who, to my surprise, remembered Marianne. "She always brought you a thermos of tea when you waited outside," Rachel said, and for a moment my throat closed up. I told her about the situation, and she helped me formally close the joint account, transferring the remaining funds into my private account and filing a fraud report on the unauthorized withdrawals. I also discovered that Evan had listed my address as the storage location for a second vehicle, a mid-size SUV he rarely used but kept at my property to avoid additional taxes in Flagstaff. I had signed the co-ownership papers for that car under the impression that it would help with insurance rates. Now I saw it for what it was, yet another manipulation. I took photographs of the vehicle still covered in dust in my garage and started the paperwork to declare it an abandoned asset. I filed a notice with the DMV, sent an official letter to both Kimberly and Evan informing them of my intent to claim the vehicle as unclaimed property, and gave them 30 days to respond. They didn't. Meanwhile, Kimberly began calling almost daily. I never picked up. The voicemails began chipper, then pleading, then accusatory. "Dad, this is really immature," she said in one. "You're acting like a child. We tried to help you and you're throwing it in our faces." In another, her tone had sharpened into something darker. "You're making a mistake. If you keep pushing this, you'll only end up hurting yourself." I recorded every voicemail. I forwarded them to Martin. He instructed me not to engage, not even to reply, and I obeyed. My silence was the only power I had left that they couldn't twist. One morning, about 10 days into the process, I received a knock on the door. I looked through the peephole to see a courier standing there with a folder in hand. He asked me to sign, which I did, and then he handed me the envelope and left. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Kimberly and Evan's lawyer, accusing me of willfully spreading defamatory claims about their intentions and requesting that I refrain from interfering with their legal authority to care for me. Martin laughed when I showed it to him. "Empty posturing," he said. "They're hoping to intimidate you into silence, but they don't realize you have the law on your side now, and me." The evaluations took place over the course of 3 days. The neurologist asked me questions that felt designed for children. Names of presidents, the season, the name of the city, and then progressed to more complex memory and reasoning tests. I performed well. The psychiatrist was more interested in my emotional stability, in whether I understood the consequences of my actions, whether I could articulate my needs. I told him everything, not just about the ring, but about the slow erosion that had preceded it, the distance, the manipulation, the use of my love as a currency. He asked if I ever felt hopeless. I told him I had learned long ago not to expect hope from others, that it was a thing you built yourself, brick by brick, when the world stopped offering it freely. When the results came back, they were unequivocal. I was of sound mind and judgment, in full possession of my faculties, with no indication of cognitive impairment or delusional behavior. The documents were notarized and submitted to the court. 3 days later, Martin received a call from Kimberly's attorney requesting an urgent mediation meeting to resolve matters amicably. Martin advised against attending, but I insisted. I needed to look them in the eye. We met in a downtown office space that reeked of scented air freshener and artificial civility. Kimberly arrived in a sharp navy blue blazer and far too much perfume. Evan wore a tight expression that didn't quite hide the panic in his eyes. Their lawyer, a slick man with a shiny tie, tried to frame their petition as an act of concern born of love and duty. I asked them point blank why they had sold Marianne's ring. Kimberly's mouth twisted. "Because it was sitting in a drawer collecting dust," she said. "It wasn't doing anyone any good. You were clinging to it like a security blanket and it was holding you back." I stared at her, and something inside me went very still. "That ring," I said slowly, "was the only thing left in this world that reminded me of what it meant to be loved unconditionally. You didn't just sell a piece of gold, you dismantled a legacy." She rolled her eyes. Evan looked away. Their lawyer started talking again, offering compromises: partial access to my accounts, limited medical proxy, supervised visitation. I stood up. "This conversation is over," I said. "You came for my life. Now I'm taking it back." That night, I drafted a new will. Martin helped me reassign all my assets, establishing a trust that would benefit a local scholarship program in Marianne's name. Every remaining dollar of mine, the house, the car, the savings, was placed in that fund. Kimberly and Evan were removed as beneficiaries. I wrote them each a letter, not out of sentiment, but clarity, explaining that this was the consequence of their actions, that family was not a birthright but a commitment. I left the letters unsigned. They would understand what silence meant. Then I packed a small bag, left my house at dawn, and checked into a modest extended-stay hotel on the outskirts of town, using a different name, paying cash. I didn't want them to know where I was. I had changed my phone number, my email, my mailing address. I told Martin how to reach me, and no one else. For the first time in months, maybe years, I slept through the night. No dreams, no memories, just silence, the kind that didn't ache. It wasn't over. I knew that. But I had shifted the balance. They had come for everything, my dignity, my memory, my past, and now they would learn that I was not just a burden to manage, not a soft old man to be reshaped and redirected. I was their reckoning, and I was just getting started. By the time the court date arrived, something in me had settled into a state that I can only describe as terminal clarity, the kind of quiet determination that doesn't require adrenaline or shouting, or even anticipation, because every possible outcome had already played out in my mind during long, sleepless nights, rehearsed like a battle hymn. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Friday, and I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, dressed in the same dark gray suit I had worn to Marianne's funeral, the lapels still carrying the faint scent of cedar from the closet where I had carefully kept it all these years. I wasn't trying to make a statement, not exactly, but I wanted to be seen not as frail or nostalgic, but as deliberate, intact, unbroken. Martin met me at the steps, briefcase in hand, his expression unreadable but calm. and as we made our way through security and down the echoing marble hallways, he leaned toward me and said quietly, "They're not expecting this." I nodded, saying, "Nothing," because I had nothing left to say to people who saw my age as evidence of decline rather than the accumulation of endurance. In the courtroom, Kimberly and Evan sat at the petitioner's table, their lawyer flipping through a folder of documents that now meant very little, given the evaluations, the counterfilings, the full rescindment of power of attorney privileges. Kimberly didn't look at me. Evan's eyes darted in my direction once, then quickly back to the floor, as if the weight of what they'd done was beginning to land like an unwelcome guest. The judge, a stout woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a gavel that she used sparingly, began the session with procedural formality. When she asked whether the petitioners wished to proceed with their motion for guardianship in light of the evaluation submitted to the court, their lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor, we would like to request a continuance to gather further documentation." The judge looked at him over her glasses and replied, "You've already submitted 2 affidavits, neither of which withstand scrutiny against the certified evaluations provided by independent specialists. Do you have a rebuttal from a licensed physician?" The lawyer hesitated. "No, Your Honor, not at this time." The judge nodded slowly. "Then, this petition is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Bryce is fully competent and retains all legal rights and autonomy. Further attempts to interfere with his estate or person will be viewed as harassment and dealt with accordingly." Her gavel struck once, and the sound echoed like thunder in the silence that followed. I did not look at Kimberly. I did not look at Evan. I gathered my papers, stood, and walked calmly out of the courtroom as though I were walking out of a tomb. Outside, the air was heavy and dry, the sky blank with sun, and Martin exhaled in that way men do when the storm has passed but the ground is still wet beneath their feet. "You did well," he said. I didn't answer. I didn't feel victorious. I felt like someone who had just narrowly stepped back from the edge of a cliff and realized that the fall wouldn't have killed him. It would have buried everything else. We walked to the parking lot in silence. I got into my car and sat with the engine off for several minutes, staring at the steering wheel, my hands resting on my knees. I thought of Mary Ann, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a presence that had never truly left the seams of my life, the one voice I trusted beyond my own. What would she have said if she saw our daughter now? Would she have wept? Would she have blamed me? Would she have taken my hand or looked away? That evening, I returned to my old house for the first time in over a month. I had locked it when I left, but now I turned the key and stepped into the familiar scent of wood polish, dust, and something else. Something like finality. The mail had piled up. Light drifted through the blinds in familiar slats, cutting the living room into long ribbons of golden air. I walked through the rooms slowly, like someone visiting a museum of their own life. I ran my hand across the back of the couch where Mary Ann used to fall asleep with a book on her lap. I stood in the kitchen and touched the faded tile where Kimberly had dropped her first glass bowl. I stared at the empty space on the nightstand where the ring had once lived. And then I picked up the phone and called Veronica Page, the real estate agent Martin had recommended months ago. I told her I was ready to sell the house, ready to let it all go. Not because I didn't love it, but because I had finally realized that it no longer belonged to the life I was going to live next. The next few weeks moved quickly. Veronica arranged viewings. The house was listed, photographed, marketed, and within days offers began to come in. I chose one. Not the highest, but the most earnest, a young couple with 2 children who wrote a letter saying they wanted to raise their family in a home that had history. I accepted. The closing date was set. The papers were signed. The deposit cleared. And just like that, the last physical remnant of my old life was no longer mine. But it didn't hurt. Not the way I expected, If anything, it felt like removing a weight I'd been carrying for too long without realizing how heavy it had become. The same week the sale closed, I finalized the transfer of funds into the Mary Ann Bryce Memorial Trust, a scholarship program for underprivileged girls pursuing education in the sciences. Mary Ann had wanted to be a teacher once. Life had pulled her in another direction, but her mind had always burned bright with knowledge, curiosity, and the urge to uplift. Now, in some small way, her light would go on shining through the ambition of strangers. On a Tuesday afternoon, just as the sun began its long descent behind the mountains, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, no stamp. Hand-delivered. The handwriting was familiar. Kimberly. Inside, a single page. "You've humiliated us," it read. "I hope you're proud. Whatever you think you've won, it won't last. You'll die alone, and no one will remember you." There was no signature, no apology, no recognition. I folded the letter once and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, beneath Mary Ann's obituary and our wedding license. Not out of sentiment, but out of principle. Proof, artifact, record. There would be no response. I spent the rest of that evening walking the neighborhood in my new part of town, passing houses that didn't know me, families that didn't recognize my silhouette. And yet, there was comfort in the anonymity, a kind of freedom. The world had moved on from me long ago. I was only now learning how to do the same. I stopped at a bench near the park and watched children play beneath the evening sky, their laughter bright and unfiltered, and I thought of Hazel and Jonah, my grandchildren, whom I hadn't seen in years. I wondered if they knew what had happened, if they had been told some version of events, if they believed it, if they cared. Perhaps one day they would look for me. Perhaps not. I didn't know. And for the first time, I didn't need to. As I sat beneath the wide Arizona sky, alone but not abandoned, calm but not complacent, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt full, not of anger, not of grief, but of peace. It had cost me everything to get here, but it was mine, and no one would ever take it from me again. It's been 11 months since I last heard their voices. No calls, no messages, not even a forwarded envelope from a lawyer. I suppose, in their minds, I've been erased, or perhaps relegated to that dark, shrinking corner of memory where the inconvenient are shelved and left to gather dust. I sometimes wonder if they even tell people I'm still alive, or if they've moved on to a version of the story where I died quietly in a nursing home, blessing them with my last breath and a check they never deserved. But the truth is less dramatic and more complete. I wake up most mornings before the sun rises, not because I must, but because I want to, because the silence in this new apartment feels clean, and the first light through the curtains doesn't remind me of what's gone, but of what I chose. The room is simple. A bookshelf, a desk, a bed, a chair that doesn't creak. But it is mine entirely. There is no drawer full of borrowed keys, no unspoken threat of uninvited guests, no invisible hand rearranging my life under the guise of help. Just me and the things I kept on purpose. A photograph of Mary Ann at 32, smiling at the sea. Breeze on our first trip to Monterey. The small wooden owl she gave me on our 10th anniversary, saying it reminded her of how I watched the world, always quietly, always completely, and a copy of her last letter to me, folded so many times the paper has softened to cloth. I read it now and then, though I no longer need the words. They live in me like marrow. Once a week, I walk to the library and help reshelve returned books. No one asked me to. I simply offered, and they let me. The librarian, a bright-eyed woman in her 40s named Celeste, once said, "You move like a man who used to carry weight." I told her I still do, just not on my back. Sometimes we sit and talk during her lunch break. She doesn't ask about my past. I don't ask about hers. It's a quiet kindness, the sort people forget how to offer. On weekends, I volunteer at a small food bank on the edge of town. The people there are tired, often silent, sometimes proud to the point of self-erasure, and I recognize in their eyes the same expression I once saw in my mirror, that quiet grief of being needed less than you once were. I don't try to cheer them up. I hand them the bags. I say their names when I can. Sometimes that's all a person needs, to be called by name, to be seen without a question mark. The Marianne Bryce Memorial Trust has already helped 3 young women begin their college education. I received handwritten notes from 2 of them, thanking me for the opportunity. One wrote that she kept a copy of Marianne's scholarship essay, the one I submitted posthumously from an old journal, pinned to her dorm room wall as motivation. I wept when I read that, not because it was sentimental, but because it was proof that memory can survive outside of grief, that legacy is not built from objects, but from the quiet echo of goodness that continues in strangers. Marianne would have smiled, not with pride, but with that steady, soft joy she carried when good things happen to good people. She would have said, "Let them have the ring. We have something better now." I do not expect to see Kimberly again. If I do, it will likely be in a place neither of us can control. A hospital room, a graveside, an accidental crossing in a supermarket aisle where she hesitates, unsure whether to pretend not to notice or to force a brittle smile. I will not make it easier for her. Forgiveness, if it ever comes, will be silent, unacknowledged, and complete only in absence. Evan, I imagine, has already moved on, perhaps regretting only the failure, not the betrayal. I do not hate them. Hatred is too large a room to rent in a heart already full. But I will not leave the door open, not now, not ever. Some nights I sit by the window and watch the city lights flicker beneath the mountain shadow. I think of the life I built, the woman I loved, the child we raised, the mistakes we made, the peace I earned not through forgiveness but through refusal. Refusal to be buried before I was dead. Refusal to be rewritten by those who thought age equaled erasure. I still dream sometimes, not of the past, but of something quieter. Long car rides with no destination, the weight of a hand on mine, the laughter of children I do not know, and the ring, not as a piece of gold, but as a circle unbroken, a story, uncut. I was not the man they remembered. I was the man they never truly knew. And now, finally, I belong only to myself.